"It's just a prank," the SEAL said, and laughed. The sound carried across the wet concrete of the dive tower, the way sound carries over open water at dawn, flat and far and without mercy. Special Warfare Operator First Class Tanner Brandt stood at the lip of the training tank with his arms folded across a chest the width of a hatch, and behind him his squad arranged themselves into the loose, grinning crescent that young men make when one of them has decided to be cruel and the rest have decided to watch. Steam rose off the surface of the water in slow ribbons. It was 4 minutes past 6 in the morning, and the woman he had just pushed had not yet come up. She had arrived 20 minutes earlier in civilian clothes, a plain dark jacket and slacks the color of harbor stone, a blank visitor badge clipped to her collar with no name printed on it, and no rank. She had walked the length of the deck once, slowly, the way a person walks a room they intend to live in. She had put one hand flat on the cold steel rim of the 25-foot combat training tank and looked down into it for a long moment, and then she had simply stood there at the edge, watching the water hold the ceiling lights in broken silver. To Brandt, she was furniture. She was the new front office clerk, the paperwork girl, some safety office hire who liked to hover near the real work and pretend she understood it. And the new girl, in his world, had to earn the water. So he had crossed the deck in 3 long strides, said something about baptism, and put both hands on her shoulders and shoved her in. Around them, the base was still coming awake. Beyond the tower's open bay doors, the harbor lay gray and enormous, under a sky that had not yet decided on a color, and the smell of it came in on the cold air, salt and diesel, and the green mineral breath of the sea, the smell of every place the woman in the water had ever loved and lost something. The other trainees drifted toward the tank, the way young men drift toward a fight, half ashamed and unable to look away. A few of them laughed already, in advance, the borrowed laugh of men who have decided whose side is safe. Only one hung back at the edge of the crescent, with his hands at his sides, and didn't laugh at all. Now the crescent leaned forward. Now they waited for the thing they always waited for. The flailing, the gasp, the undignified scramble for the wall that would tell them she was exactly what they had decided she was. It did not come. The water took her the way water takes something it recognizes. There was no splash of panic, no churn. There was only a seam opening on the dark surface, and then, unhurried, that same seam closing. Below, she had gone in clean, arms crossing at the last instant, and she had let herself drop the way a diver drops, sinking a body's length before her legs found their rhythm and turned her, patient, back toward the light. She was not frightened. Fear was a country she had left a long time ago and had no plans to visit. She surfaced at the center of the tank without a gasp, not a sputter, not a cough, not the sharp animal inhale of a person who has just been underwater against their will. Her breath came out in a single long, controlled exhale, the exhale of a body that had rationed air in worse places than this, and then she was treading, easy, her dark hair sleek to her skull, her eyes finding Brandt on the rim and resting there. The steam curled between them. On the deck, no one laughed. Brandt recovered first, because men like Brandt always recover first. He spread his hands and grinned wider, to paper over the half-second of silence. "It's just a prank, lady. Relax." He said it to her, and to his squad both. Everybody swims here. She swam 3 easy strokes to the wall and lifted herself out with a single economy of the arms, water sheeting off the harbor stone slacks, and she stood, dripping, and she did not shiver, and she did not glare. She looked at him with an expression as level as the waterline, and what she said was worse than any curse he had been braced for. "Thank you," she said. "The water's good." Then she picked up the blank badge that had come loose in the tank, clipped it back to her soaked collar, and walked toward the equipment bench as though nothing at all had happened, leaving a dark track of footprints across the concrete. Across the tower, in the shadow of the observation catwalk, a man who had watched 10,000 swimmers go into that tank stopped with his coffee halfway to his mouth. Master Chief Ezra Bishop had spent 53 years learning what the water tells you about a person, and 30 of those years teaching it, and he had just been told something he could not yet name. He set the coffee down on the rail. He watched the woman walk away in her wet clothes, with her spine straight and her hands loose, and a cold and specific attention came into his face, the attention of a man who has heard a single note and recognized the instrument. Brant was still grinning at his squad. Bishop wasn't grinning at all. By the time the morning cycle began in earnest, the woman in the wet clothes had made herself useful in a way that no one asked for, and no one, at first, noticed. She had drifted to the equipment bench along the north wall, where the night shift had left a dozen student rigs half broken down and fouled, hoses coiled wrong, second stages hanging in the puddle water. She had picked up a rag from the bench, dried her hands, and begun to work. She did not announce it. She simply took a rig that had been rigged by a nervous trainee at midnight, and without hurry, unrigged it, and rigged it again the right way. Her hands moved with the flat economy of a person who has done a thing 10,000 times in the dark and in the cold, and once or twice while the world was trying to kill her. Everything she touched came off the bench squared to the same angle, hoses routed clean, valves quarter-turned back off their stops the way the manual says, and almost no one bothers to do. Bishop saw the gear before he let himself look at the woman again. He came down off the catwalk and walked the bench the way an instructor walks a bench, hands behind his back, and he stopped at the 3 rigs she had already finished. They were dressed like something out of a doctrine plate. Not fast. Not showy. Correct, down to the last centimeter, the way gear is dressed by someone for whom a sloppy rig once meant a name read out at a memorial. "Where'd you learn to dress a rig like that?" he asked. His voice was gravel, worn smooth by salt. She did not look up from the buckle she was seating. "Somewhere cold," she said. That was all. Somewhere cold. Bishop had been somewhere cold, too, and he knew that the word was a door with a whole life behind it, and he knew better than to knock. He looked at the woman's hands instead, at the small, pale seam of an old scar running along the meat of the left thumb, the kind of scar a regulator leaves when a diver claws it back into their mouth at depth, with fingers that have gone stupid with cold. He looked at the way her wet slacks had dried stiff with the chlorine of the tank, and she had not once complained. He picked up the nearest rig, checked the work she had done, and found nothing to fix. He put it down again. He had learned the water in an era that no longer existed, in a navy that had beaten its lessons into him with cold and pressure and the occasional loss. And the one thing all those years had given him was an ear for the false note. Most people in the water were false notes, striving and frightened and pretending, and you spent your career gentling them toward competence one breath at a time. And then, once or twice in a life, a person went into the water, and there was no false note at all, only the true clean tone of someone the water had already finished with. He had heard that tone this morning, off a woman he had watched get shoved in like a joke. It had not left him. Then he did the only thing a master diver does when he has quietly decided a room has changed and no one else has noticed yet. He moved his coffee to the other hand so that his right hand was free, and he stood a little straighter, and he waited. Brant found her at the bench an hour later and could not leave it alone. "Careful with those, clerk," he said, loud enough for the deck. "That's operator gear. Wouldn't want the paperwork girl to break something she can't spell." His squad laughed on cue. One of them, a lean, quiet trainee named Dominic Salas, did not laugh, but he did not say anything either, and he looked at the concrete when Brant glanced his way. The woman set the finished rig on the bench, square to the edge, and straightened. "It's clean," she said mildly. "You're welcome to check it." Brant did not check it. Checking it would have meant admitting there was something to check, and under the fluorescent lights, for just a heartbeat, the tower went away, and there was black water, and the pale underside of a ship's hull hanging over her like a low-iron sky, and the small green ghost of a depth gauge, and beside her in the dark, a second diver, whose slow bubbles she could feel more than see. Then the fluorescent lights came back, and the fouled rigs, and the laughter that had already moved on to something else. She picked up the next rig and began, patiently, to make it right. The nickname was Airborne by noon. It moved the way these things move now, not mouth to mouth, but thumb to thumb. In the squad's group chat, a photograph of the woman at the equipment bench with her back turned and 3 words under it, and then the 3 words everywhere, in the chow line, on the deck, murmured behind a hand, and then not even behind a hand. The paperwork girl. It was a small cruelty, and small cruelties are the ones that travel farthest, because they cost the men who carry them nothing at all. Brant was the engine of it. He had found in the silent woman a perfect surface for his own restlessness, a thing that would not fight back, and so could be pushed forever. And he pushed. He held doors and swept his arm and called her ma'am in a voice built to mean the opposite. He asked her, in front of the cycle, whether the front office had run out of staplers and sent her down for a swim. He was good at it, the way he was good at everything physical, with an easy, gifted cruelty that the younger trainees admired because they were young and had not yet learned what it costs a man to be admired for that. The woman wrote it down. She had a plain notebook, water-swollen now at one corner, and in it, in a small square hand, she logged each thing. Not with heat, with the flat patience of a person completing a checklist. Time, location, who was present, what was said, what was done. She did not do it to wound, and she did not do it to threaten. She did it because she had learned, somewhere cold, that the water keeps no record and men keep worse ones, and that the only defense against the slow erasure of the truth is to write it down while it is still bleeding. There is a kind of courage that looks like nothing at all. It does not shout, and it does not swing. It simply refuses to be erased. Every time the 3 words moved across the deck, the woman did not flinch and did not answer. And in not answering, she did a thing the young men could not understand and would spend years learning. She declined to hand them the reaction that would have made the cruelty worthwhile. A joke needs a wound to land in. She gave it none. And so the joke, over the days, began quietly to curdle in the mouths of the men telling it, though not one of them could have said why, and Brant least of all. Salas watched her write once, from the far end of the bench, and something moved behind his young face. He was the only one of them who had noticed that she never once looked away from the tank, that whatever else the deck was doing, her eyes came back and back to the water like a compass needle to north. He almost said something to her. He didn't. But that night he did not add anything to the group chat, and he read the 3 words under the photograph, and he did not laugh. If you have ever watched someone be made small by people who were sure they were bigger, you already know the particular quiet of that dive tower. You already know why this channel exists. If a story like this one has ever put a stone in your chest, do this one small thing before we go under the surface with her. Subscribe to Honor Tales, so the next story finds you too. Then stay, because the water is about to give something back. Brant saved his best for the end of the day. He waited until the cycle was secure in gear, until the deck was full and the acoustics were good. And then he called across the whole tower, bright and public. "Hey, clerk, tomorrow. You gonna earn the water again? Or was this morning a one-time thing?" The woman closed her notebook. She looked at him across the wet concrete with those level eyes, and she smiled with no warmth in it at all. A smile like the flat calm that comes over the sea right before the barometer falls. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "We'll see who earns it." He escalated, because contempt is a fire that has to be fed. It was not enough anymore to say things. Words had bounced off her all week and left him standing there holding them. So on the second morning, Brant went to the gear, and gear is the one thing in that building that is never a joke. He did it while the cage was busy, a quick pair of hands moving over the bench where the borrowed rigs waited. He swapped the fins she had drawn for the day, left fin for a right, a mismatched pair that would fight a swimmer in the water and tire the legs and make a person look, to the whole watching cycle, like they had no idea what they were doing. And on the weight belt, he backed the buckle off a half-turn, loosened it just enough that it would seat wrong and slip, so that the paperwork girl would either catch it and look paranoid, or miss it and dump her weights on the bottom in front of everyone. Either way, she lost. He walked away pleased. It was, to him, still a prank. She caught it in the time it takes to breathe out. She had lifted the belt off the bench, and her hands were already moving, and the hands knew before the mind bothered to say anything, the way a musician's hands know a wrong string. The buckle came into her palm, and her thumb found the slack that should not have been there, and her whole body simply paused. One clean stillness, the way a hunting bird pauses. Then, without a word, without so much as a glance around the deck for the culprit, she reset the buckle with 2 economical movements, seated it hard, tested it against her hip, and hung the belt back on the rack where it swung once and settled dead level, the buckle catching the light like a small closed eye. She picked up the mismatched fins, turned them over, saw the swap, and set them aside on the bench in a neat pair, toe to toe, and drew a matched set from the rack instead. All of it took perhaps 8 seconds. She never changed expression. Bishop saw the whole thing from the catwalk, and the last of his uncertainty went out of him like a tide. Because that was not the reaction of a clerk. A clerk who caught a loosened buckle would have gasped, or laughed nervously, or gone looking for someone to tell. This woman had caught a rigged weight belt with her fingertips and corrected it with the bored competence of a person disarming a thing she had disarmed 100 times before. And then she had squared it away and moved on, as if the sabotage were simply weather. He looked at the economy in her hands, the way not one motion was wasted, the way everything ended square and level and safe, and he thought, with the cold, clean certainty of a man who has spent his life reading water, "I know what you are. I do not yet know your name, but I know what you are." Under the lights, the black water came again, the swim in, the hull above, and beside her in the dark, close enough to touch, a second diver, a young man named Sean Farrow, whose slow bubbles she could feel against the current, whose gloved hand had found her forearm once in the black and squeezed, twice, the old signal, "I'm here, I'm good." She had squeezed back. In the tower, her hand closed once around empty air. Bishop crossed to the bench after she had gone and looked at the mismatched fins she had set aside, toe to toe, and the weight belt hanging dead level on the rack, and he understood that she had caught the sabotage, corrected it, preserved the evidence, and said nothing, all in the space of a breath. That was not the behavior of a person defending herself. That was the behavior of a person building a case, methodical, cold, certain that the day of accounting would come, and determined to have the water on her side when it did. He looked once toward the tank where she had gone, and he thought of the redacted name on the roster in the cage, and the reporting date, and the single intact word beneath the black bar. Commander. He said nothing either, but that night he did not sleep well. Then she opened it and picked up the matched fins and carried them to the water. Bishop went looking for the truth in the one place the truth is kept, which is paper. That evening, after the cycle had cleared out and the tower had gone quiet, and the water lay flat and black and enormous in the dim, he let himself into the command's equipment cage where the roster board hung, and he pulled the inbound personnel sheet for the week. He ran his thumb down it. Instructors, a supply chief, 2 students recycling from an earlier class, and at the bottom, the incoming change of command line, the new commanding officer reporting aboard, and where the name should have been, there was a black bar, redacted, a security hold on the identity, the kind of hold they only put on a name that has spent time in places without flags, a reporting date of tomorrow, rank line intact, where the name was gone. Commander. Bishop stood a long time in the cold cage with the sheet in his hand. He found Brant in the parking lot, alone, and he did not raise his voice, because master divers who have to raise their voices have already lost. You had a good week, Bishop said. You want to have a good career, too. So hear me. Whatever you think that woman is, stop. Tomorrow you're going to wish you'd spent this week being someone else. If she is who I think she is, you want to be somewhere, very far from that water, when she decides she's done being patient. Brant laughed. It was the same laugh from the tank rim, easy and gifted and sure. The clerk, he said. Master Chief, respect. But you've been breathing helium. She dresses gear and writes in a little book. I've forgotten scarier things than her. Bishop looked at him for a moment, with something that was almost pity. That's the trouble with your kind of good, he said. You've never once been in water, deep enough to be wrong. He walked away and left the young man grinning in the dark. Somewhere in the fear you feel right now, for that arrogant young man is the reason you clicked on this story, and the reason you're still here. If you want to be in the room when the water finally answers him, and it is about to, take 1 second and subscribe to Honor Tales now, so the ending doesn't slip past you. Because tomorrow, the paperwork girl reports aboard. Inside the tower, the woman stood alone at the tank's edge in the last of the light. She put one hand flat on the cold steel lip, the way she had the first morning, and she looked down into the black water that held nothing now but the dark. Her reflection looked back up at her, faceless in the low light, and she stayed there a long time, breathing slow, the way you breathe when you are deciding whether to forgive. Her room that night was small and square and nearly empty, the room of a person who has learned to travel light because heavy things get left behind at depth. There was a duffel, still packed. There was a single-framed photograph turned face down on the desk, which she didn't turn over. And there was a folded document, cream-colored, soft at the creases from being opened and closed too many times, and this she did open, under the low lamp, and read as she had read it 100 times, not for the words, but for the weight. The words said Bronze Star. The words said, in the bloodless grammar of a citation for conspicuous gallantry, 2011. And behind the grammar was the black water off a coast she was not allowed to name, and the ship, and the long, silent swim in the dark toward the pale, hanging hull, with the small green ghost of the depth gauge counting her down. She had been 26 years old. She had been the lead, and Sean Farrow had been on her wing, 23, and grinning even through a regulator, the best natural diver she ever swam with, and the only one who ever made the black water feel less like drowning. They had done everything right. That was the part no one understood. Afterward, the part the citation could not hold. They had done everything right. and the rebreather had failed anyway. Deep, where a failure is not an emergency but a sentence, the closed circuit fouling on itself and turning the air he breathed into something that was not air. She had felt his hand find her forearm in the dark. 2 squeezes. I'm here. And then a third that wasn't the signal, that was something else, and then his hand had begun, slowly, to let go. She remembered the exact temperature of that water, the way you remember the temperature of the worst day of your life, cold enough that the cold became a sound, a high, thin ringing in the bones of the skull. She remembered the pale hull swelling above them as they closed, vast and silent. A whole sleeping city of iron hung over their heads, with nothing between it and them but black water and training and each other. She remembered how Pharaoh had touched her arm at the turn, the old signal, 2 squeezes, and how she had felt rather than seen his grin around the mouthpiece, because Sean Pharaoh was the rarest kind of man, the kind who could make the inside of a nightmare feel survivable simply by being there beside you, unafraid, 23 years old, and in love with the deep, the way other men are in love with the light. And she remembered the moment it changed. Not a bang, not an alarm, just a wrongness in the rhythm of his bubbles, a hitch, a stutter in the slow silver rope of his breathing, and then his hand on her forearm again, and this time, the third squeeze that was not a signal at all, but a question, and then a plea, and then the terrible slow opening of his fingers as the fouled circuit turned the air in his lungs to poison, and the deep began, patiently, to take him. She had brought him up. She had done the thing that cannot be done, hauled a grown man and 40 pounds of gear up through the black from a depth that punishes you for rising too fast, breathing for 2 out of 1 failing set of lungs, sharing her own mouthpiece down into his slack mouth, breath by breath as she climbed, her own vision narrowing to a green pinhole, the pressure screaming in her ears to slow down, and the clock screaming in her chest to hurry. And she had split the difference the way the procedures now say to split it. And she had gotten him to the surface and into the boat, and it had not been enough. Some things you do everything right, and it is still not enough. That was the lesson the water taught her, the one she carried folded soft in a duffel from posting to posting. The water does not care how good you are, it only cares whether you were careful. So she had become the most careful person alive. She had gone back down into the pipeline, and then, worse, into the offices, and she had written the procedures, the closed-circuit dive procedures the young men in this very tower were now trained from, the checklists and the depth rules and the buddy protocols with Sean Pharaoh's death encoded in every line, though his name appeared in none of them. She had made herself into rules so that no one else would have to feel a hand let go in the dark. And now she had come to command the place where those rules were taught, and on her first morning, a gifted boy had decided that reckless was the same as brave, and had shoved a stranger into deep water for a laugh. She refolded the citation along its soft creases. She set it face down beside the photograph she had not turned over. She turned off the lamp. In the dark, she lay with her eyes open and listened to the far sound of the sea against the base breakwater, and she made the decision she had come into the room undecided about. She would give the water 1 more day to teach him, and if the water could not, she would. The third morning was buddy breathing, and buddy breathing is a covenant. It is the drill where 2 divers share 1 source of air, passing a single-second stage back and forth in the water, 1 breath each, trusting the other man with the most basic thing there is. It is done shallow, and it is done slow, and it is watched, always, by a safety who counts the passes and owns the authority to end it the instant it turns wrong. On the covenant of that count, everyone's life rests. It is the one evolution on the deck where showing off is not bravado, but blasphemy. The woman knew the Covenant better than any person on the deck because she had rebuilt it. There had been a time, years back, when buddy breathing in this very command had been run looser, faster, prouder, when the count had been a suggestion and the safety a formality, and men had come up, gray and shaking, and called it character. She had ended that. She had sat in the offices no one wanted and rewritten the evolution line by line, put the authority to stop it in the hands of the safety, and made that authority absolute, written the depth and the intervals in ink so that the Covenant would no longer depend on the humility of the strongest man in the water. Every rule in it was a scar. Every scar had a name she carried, and the tower did not know. Brant was paired with Wade Ellison, a quiet 24-year-old who wanted to be a SEAL the way drowning men want the surface, and who would have swum into a wall if Brant told him it was a door. And Brant, who had spent 3 mornings failing to make the clerk flinch, decided the audience he really wanted to impress was watching from the equipment bench, and he decided to make the Covenant into a stunt. He took them deeper than the evolution called for. When the safety, a young second class, called the pass count and told him to come shallow, Brant waved him off with a lazy hand, the same lazy hand that had shoved a stranger into a tank, and he held Ellison down at the far end where the water went from green to the deep blue-black of real depth, and he stretched the intervals between passes, longer, making a game of the younger man's rising need for air, grinning around his own mouthpiece, because to Brant the whole world was a thing you could push, and it would give. The woman set down her notebook. She had been watching, as she watched everything, and she saw the safety margin go, saw the young second class hesitate with his authority in his hands, and no courage to use it against a man like Brant, saw the intervals stretch past the line the procedures drew, the procedures she had written, and she stood, unhurried, and moved to the edge of the tank without a sound. And for the first time all week, she smiled at Tanner Brant, directly, a small, exact smile, cold as the flat calm before the barometer falls. She knew exactly what she was watching, because she had written the rule that Brant was breaking, had written it at a desk with her jaw tight, had chosen each word of it so that a young man at the bottom of a tank would never have to depend on the mercy of a show-off for his next breath. She could see the physiology of it unfolding on its own schedule, indifferent, the way she could always see it, the slow narrowing that Ellison himself would not feel until it was already too late. She had seconds. She used the first of them to be certain, and the certainty was a cold, flat thing, and it settled in her like ballast. Brant saw it and misread it, the way he had misread everything. He thought it was surrender. He thought the clerk was finally impressed. He held Ellison 1 interval longer to seal the win. That was the interval the water had been waiting for. Wade Ellison blacked out at the bottom of the tank. It happens without drama, which is the terror of it. There was no thrash, no clawing for the surface. His need for air simply crossed the line where the body stops asking, and his eyes rolled up soft, and his mouthpiece drifted from his slack lips in a silver rope of the last breath he had, and he began to sink, sideways, and his trailing gear line snagged the weight rack at the tank's bottom and held him there, a young man folding gently into the dark, 25 feet down, while his lungs filled with the deep blue-black. For 1 heartbeat, the whole tower froze. The safety shouted and did not move. Brant spun in the water, and the grin was gone, and in its place was the pure animal blankness of a man discovering, too late, that the world can push back. The instructors on the deck lunged for the edge. Bishop was already roaring for the medics. The woman was already in the water. She had gone in the instant Ellison's mouthpiece drifted. No jacket, no fins, no hesitation. A clean, dark shape cutting down through the 25 feet, with her arms swept back and her legs driving in the long, unpanicked rhythm of a body that had done this in worse water than this and against a harder clock. The water closed over her, and the tower's noise vanished. The shouting and the pounding feet all swallowed at once into the enormous underwater quiet. And in that quiet, she was home. 25 feet is nothing. 25 feet of chlorinated pool light was a summer afternoon compared to the black she had swum, and her body knew it. And her body did the thing bodies do when a life has trained them for exactly this. It went calm, and it went fast, and it wasted nothing. She reached the bottom in the time it took the instructors to reach the rim. She did not fumble. Her hands found the snagged line where it fouled the rack, and her thumb found the release, and she cleared it with one motion. Hand geometry, economy, nothing wasted. And she got an arm across Ellison's chest from behind, tucked his chin, angled his airway, and began the controlled ascent that the procedures demand and that panic makes impossible, rising with him, neither too fast nor too slow. A diver bringing a life up out of the black, the way she had once brought up a life that would not stay. Halfway up, she felt the old grief try to rise with them, the ghost of a different weight in her arms, a different young man, and she did the thing she had taught herself to do, which was to set the grief down gently on the bottom of her own mind and keep climbing, because Ellison wasn't Pharaoh, and this water wasn't that water, and this time, this one time, she was going to be enough. She broke the surface with him, and the sound she made was not a gasp. It was a command. On the deck. Now. Airway. They took him from her arms onto the concrete. She came up over the wall in a single motion and was on her knees beside him before anyone had decided who was in charge, her hands already moving, tilting the young man's head, checking the airway, and Ellison's chest hitched, and he coughed the deep water back up onto the concrete and dragged in a whooping, ragged breath. Alive, alive, and the whole tower exhaled at once. And in the silence after that breath, Master Chief Ezra Bishop looked at the woman kneeling in her soaked clothes, with the water sheeting off her, and saw at last the whole of it. As she had gone over the wall, her collar had torn back, and the visitor badge had come away, and there, on the wet skin below her throat, was the combat diver insignia inked dark and old, and beside it the pale seam of the scar he had half seen at the bench. The scar a regulator leaves at depth, and Bishop's 53 years arranged themselves in one instant into a single certain shape. He came to attention on the wet deck. His heels came together, and his spine went straight, and his hand came up in a salute so crisp it cracked the silence like ice. "Attention on deck," Bishop said, and his gravel voice carried to every corner of the tower. Commander Whitlock, "Ma'am, I did not know you were on the water." The name moved across the deck like a dropped stone across still water, ring after ring. Whitlock. Commander. The commanding officer reporting aboard. The name behind the black bar on the roster. The officer who had written the very procedures they trained from. The closed-circuit rules, with a dead man's death in every line. Reporting aboard a day early, in civilian clothes, and shoved into her own tank on her first morning for a laugh. And now, the whole week rearranged itself in the mind of every man on that deck, all at once, the way a coastline resolves out of fog. The civilian clothes had not been a clerk's clothes. They had been the plain clothes of an officer, reporting a day early to walk her own command before the ceremony made her a stranger to it. The blank badge had not been a nobody's badge. It had been a name held back for reasons above their pay grade. The quiet at the bench had not been meekness. It had been a commander taking the measure of the people she was about to be responsible for and finding out exactly who they were when they thought no one who mattered was watching. She had let them show her. That was the thing that turned the young men cold. She had said thank you. The water's good. And she had picked up her notebook. And she had let every one of them tell her, in their own words and their own cruelty, precisely who they were. Tanner Brandt stood waist-deep in the water, and his face began to come apart. Confusion first, the blank refusal. Then disbelief, the small, desperate shake of the head. Then recognition, as the roster and the redacted name and the Master Chief's salute and the ink on her throat all landed at once. Then, last and longest, horror. The flat, gray horror of a man who has finally been in water deep enough to be wrong. Commander Corinne Whitlock rose from beside the breathing young man. Water ran off her in the fluorescent light. She looked at Brandt for exactly one beat, no more, and there was no triumph in it, and no cruelty, only the level waterline calm that had frightened him from the very first morning, because he had mistaken it for weakness. Then she turned her back on him entirely, and knelt again beside Wade Ellison, and put her hand on the young man's shoulder, and said, "Low, easy. Breathe. You're up. You're up." The safety board convened before the water on the deck had dried. There was no arrest, and there was no ceremony, and both of those absences were the point. Commander Whitlock did not need to break Tanner Brandt, and she did not try. She simply let the record do what records do. The record she had been keeping in a water-swollen notebook all week, and the record the tower's own cameras had kept, of a buddy-breathing evolution taken deep. A safety call overridden, an interval stretched past the line the procedures drew until a young man sank. Recklessness in the water is not a prank, and it is not a personality. It is a finding. And the finding pulled Tanner Brandt from the pipeline that afternoon, relieved from training and held pending a hazing and safety investigation. His cycle ended, not by her rank, but by his own hand, on a safety's shoulder, waving the count away. Word of it reached the group commander, Captain Miriam Faust, before the deck had even dried, and she came down to the tower herself in her working uniform, and stood a long moment at the rim of the tank, looking at the water, and then at the woman who had gone into it. The two officers spoke quietly, apart from the others, and whatever passed between them ended with Faust bringing her hand up in a salute she did not have to give, and holding it a beat longer than protocol asked, one commander acknowledging another across the small, cold distance that only people who have done the real thing can measure. Then she left, and let Whitlock's command be Whitlock's command, which is the highest thing one officer can do for another. He came to her once, before he was walked off, and there was no fight left in him, only a young man's ruin. It was a joke, he said, and even he did not believe it now. The first morning, it was just, "I know what it was," Whitlock said. She was not unkind. She was worse than unkind. She was exact. The water doesn't care what you meant. It only cares whether you were careful. You weren't. A man breathes today because of the rules you called paperwork. Go and think about that until you're someone who could have written them. She turned to Dominic Salas, who had come to attention when everyone else did, and had held it a half-second longer, the one who had never laughed. "You hesitated all week," she told him quietly, "because you knew it was wrong, and you didn't have the rank to stop it. Now you know how that feels. Don't forget it. Some men earn the water by being loud. You'll earn it by being the one who calls the count when the loud man won't." She kept him. He would finish the cycle under her command, and he would be, in the years to come, the kind of instructor who ends an evolution the instant it turns wrong, and never once wonders whether it made him look weak. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been the quiet one at the edge of the deck, underestimated by someone louder and surer and wrong, then subscribe to Honor Tales and stay close, because the water always answers, and we will be here when it does. Dusk came to the dive tower. The cycle had gone. The great tank lay flat and black and enormous in the low light, holding the last of the day in broken silver, and Commander Corinne Whitlock stood alone at its edge in a dry uniform now, the silver oak leaf on her collar, the combat diver insignia where it belonged. She put one hand flat on the cold steel lip, the way she had the first morning when they thought she was no one, and she looked down into the water that had given something back today instead of taking it. Her phone lit against the dark. A single line, from a number with no name, from a man she had swum with in water she was not allowed to describe. Heard you made the tower interesting. There's work off the Macassar coast if you still remember how to be somewhere cold. She looked at it for a long moment, and the flat calm of her face moved, just slightly, into something that was almost a smile. She put the phone away. She left her hand on the cold steel a moment longer, where the water could reach it, and then she turned and walked out through the dark tower with her spine straight and her hands loose, and the black water held its silver behind her, and it kept, as it always keeps, its own counsel. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.